Firstly, I still love PoE, and secondly, I want to give a huge shout out to XD for working with me on this video. I've been super excited to try out Torchlight since seeing a lot of my peers try it over the past couple of months. It looks like a pretty fun ARPG. I've heard only good things about it since they did their early fixes to the game. So when it comes to the ARPG genre, Path of Exile is really seen as the gold standard these days for how things should go. But as I'm playing through Torchlight for the first couple of times, getting through early maps, and especially experiencing the early game through several characters, a couple of really glaring flaws, at least objectively, of Path of Exile are coming to light. The first of these that everyone's talked about countless times is early game progression. A couple of patches ago, Chris and co decided to talk about this idea of a vision of gatekeeping, which I think was actually guided by a really interesting ethos. The idea that once they've got you into maps, you're hooked onto Path of Exile for life. Now, from my experience, this isn't proven to be true. A lot of my friends who I used to play Path of Exile with no longer play the game because of the buffs to early game that happened several leagues ago, to Act 1 and Act 2 in particular. Frankly, I don't think it's reasonable that my highest probability of death happens within the first 5 minutes of an ARPG. In contrast, Torchlight Infinite offers a sort of looser start, a more rigid and slower tutorial in which you get to experience some of the skills, and a teaser of what's to come in the endgame. And more importantly, you're able to stand still for more than a couple of seconds without instantly dying to a bunch of creatures pounding you from behind. See, what I think an ARPG should do in the early game is give you a taste of what the game could feel like, without necessarily breaking the idea that you still are a relatively early game character and you have a long way to grow. The second most glaring thing to me was this idea about pickup radius. I'm very used to having to walk straight up to an item and grab it while it's right on top of me, and juggling between two tiny little pixels to make sure I'm on the right pixel to pick up an item in an ARPG. This not only caused me a lot of frustration, but it also leads to a lot of hand strain. In fact, I started doing a lot more hand training after last gauntlet because of how much pain it was causing me. Torchlight, though, I think establishes a pretty good middle ground between auto-looting and manual looting. Firstly, they do have automated looting pets that you can get as a free-to-play player, and those will pick up currency for you, things that any ARPG player would want to have. However, you still need to manually loot your equipable items. Even while doing this though, your pickup radius is not zero, it's actually quite large, and you're not burdened with the frustration of having to walk straight into an item and juggle between two pixels just to grab another thing. More importantly, my feeling as I play through it though is that there's still that sense of suspense when you get an unidentified rare and you don't quite know what it is. Speaking of identifying items, you're able to identify all items in Torchlight. Now this is no novel idea at all. Diablo 2 had this with Deckard Cain, and I'm not really sure why this never made it into the Path of Exile sphere. At a baseline, I don't love identifying items, however I do see the value in creating that sense of suspense. When it comes to identifying items individually, however, as opposed to en masse, I literally see nothing of value except for additional hand strain. I don't think tedium for the sake of tedium is a good idea for any sort of game. I don't see why we would then regress even further back to have to identify items each individually. I would say the most elegant advantage that Torchlight has managed to create over Path of Exile is when it comes to crafting. Now, it doesn't quite have the crafting depth that Path of Exile has, but I think it has chosen a philosophy that's much less frustrating. The idea that crafting should be progressive instead of random. You see, since the removal of powerful harvest in Path of Exile, a lot of times when we're crafting items now, we're confronted with situations in which to create a really powerful item, you need to do a complete gamble. And this complete gamble can result in the bricking of your item. In other words, putting it in a state in which you can no longer use it as a craftable base, having taken an irreversible step that has made your item not good anymore. And this is basically because we can no longer reforge keep suffix, reforge keep prefix. Of course, you can annul, but that's just another gamble on top of another gamble that can still result in a complete brick. Torchlight, on the other hand, has a really elegant crafting system. When you're about to use a currency item on an item, you're confronted with a possible list of outcomes, say something like fire res, cold res, lightning res, and erosion res. When you use that currency item on the item, you're then confronted with two more panels. The first of these panels is the item as it was before it was crafted. The second panel is the crafting outcome that actually happened. However, you're able to still reject that outcome and go back to the previous stage of your item. This implementation of progressive crafting ensures that you still have to gamble, something core to a lot of game makers these days, but you're never going to feel completely frustrated with the outcome of an item. And I tend to agree. See, I would much rather lose the cost of an attempt rather than my whole life savings when I lose at slots. The fifth and final thing that stood out to me, even though I thought it wouldn't matter at all, is the inclusion of cinematics. Path of Exile, in its entirety, has one single cinematic. In the Chamber of Innocence, Act 5. It's something a lot of players don't even know exists, and it's something that caught a lot of us by surprise when it did get implemented, and we were hoping that it would be a sign for the future. Now, I'm no story gamer, I'm much more of a power gamer, I don't care about lore at all. But there is something about having a cinematic in the game that pulls me more into the game. Additionally, I think cinematics are really good because they attract more story-based players towards a game. ARPGs are a genre that's fairly underdeveloped in my opinion, and I think has a lot of room to grow. The better the storytelling, the more types of players that will want to engage with this kind of game. And fundamentally, I think cinematics are a great way to capture a broad overarching narrative while also emphasizing the great personalities of some of the individual characters that can really draw the interest of all kinds of gamers. Of course, Path of Exile still has a lot of things like game depth and much more complex building, systems, and endgame. But none of that really takes away from some of the core things that Torchlight's offering. If I had to sum it up really quickly, I basically think that Torchlight gives you an opportunity to play in a lower stakes, lower stress, and lower strain both physically and mentally environment that really emphasizes the game part in action role-playing game. One last time, I just wanted to thank XD for sponsoring this video, and I can't wait to explore the new sandbox that they've offered to us.